Hello, I'm Sean Mallon. I'm a communication consultant based in Toronto, a former journalist with Global News, and also the host and producer of the Social Purpose Exchange, which is a series of podcasts and YouTube conversations, which is produced by the Goodman Sustainability Group, where we speak about the very kind of subjects that we're covering in this event today. And today, on this segment, we're talking about really an extraordinary personal journey in this whole area. It starts with a story about a corporation. And really, no corporate players face bigger social purpose challenges than oil and gas companies. Given that they made their fortunes by producing carbon-based fuels, they are naturally among the primary targets in the fight against climate change. Many investors and campaigners have been challenging oil and gas companies, and there appears to be a reckoning underway. In the midst of all this, the new CEO of BP, Bernard Looney, shook the industry this past summer when he proposed a radical transformation to make the firm formerly known as British Petroleum a net zero carbon emission company by the year 2050.
Providing the world with clean, reliable, affordable energy will require nothing less than reimagining energy. And today, that becomes BP's new purpose: reimagining energy for people and our planet.
As part of his effort, he brought back into BP a former employee who left because of climate change concerns and who actually became a critic from the outside. Her name is Jo Alexander, and she now has the title Purpose Exchange Manager at BP. And I'm happy to welcome her from her home in South London in a segment we're titling The Power of One Voice. Jo Alexander, great to see you.
Good to see you too, Sean. Thank you for having me today.
You are a geologist by trade. You worked for 11 years for BP. You traveled the world searching for petroleum in all kinds of exotic locations, but gradually became uncomfortable with the work you were doing, and you left. Tell me a bit about that journey that caused you to leave.
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm a geologist, so I think I've always had that tension. And so when I was at university, I learned about climate change, but it was also a degree that prepared me for working in the oil industry. So I think a lot of my friends who are geologists have this tension. And I was really proud to join BP in the early 2000s when Lord Brown was CEO, and I felt it was a really progressive company. And I think over time that sense of pride just subsided as, things changed, alternative energy went away. And then I would bury this feeling of discomfort that I had because I just got on with trying to be a really good geologist. And then when I go on holiday, this feeling would bubble up of, what am I doing with my life? And it got to a point where I just felt, another 20, 30 years doing the same thing when I knew that, the conversation about climate change was only going to get more intense. Just didn't make sense. So I just thought I need to take the brave leap and try and find a career that I felt had a positive impact.
And ultimately, when you left, you actually became a critic from the outside. You worked for an NGO called Share Action that works in investment, forcing investment system into a force for good. And actually, not only that, you went further. You're a shareholder. You went back to BP a year ago, and you rose and asked a question at the shareholders meeting. Tell me about what led you to that decision to take that action, and tell me about the question.
Yeah, so a lot of things led me to that point. I would say, I kind of had this 5-year journey from leaving BP to that point. And I just felt this responsibility to voice the concerns that not only I had, but all of, my former colleagues that I'd talked to them about. They didn't feel they could raise it. So I just felt this responsibility to. And I was also doing this course in systems change, trying to figure out what interventions you could make in systems to kind of change. And that was kind of my experiment. And I didn't really expect it to go anywhere, but I suppose it has. And maybe I'll just paraphrase the question that I asked on that day. So I introduced myself and said, as a geologist, I understand climate change. And so that I felt that my job exploring for oil and gas was in conflict with my values and I suppose my sense of purpose. And having talked to former colleagues, realized that they'd felt the same way, but they weren't able to leave to find a greener job because they'd reconciled themselves to a job that was paid the bills and wasn't necessarily meaningful. And I suppose, I mean, it just feels like a sad situation. So I asked the board, what are they going to do to give people the opportunity to contribute to a low carbon transition? Because when I was at BP, I think I had the intention early on of trying to get into what we called alternative energy back then, but lost sight of it. And I didn't see those opportunities for my former colleagues.
So tell me what the room was like when you posed that question. Was there kind of an intake of breath? And what is she doing? And I wonder what the answer was.
Yes, so the room was full of hundreds of people. BP has one of the biggest AGMs, I think, possibly in the world, and slightly intimidating setting. I asked the question actually first before anybody else asked a question. So I think it set this interesting tone that maybe they weren't expecting. I don't think they've had a former employee ask a question like that. Yeah, and I don't remember the answer very well because I think I had the adrenaline surging at that point. But I think it was something along the lines of, we are and we will do more. But yes, yeah, it didn't feel very satisfying. But that's how I expected it to land like a lead balloon. That was my expectation. It was just about kind of telling the truth and putting my point of view across. It actually didn't land like a lead balloon.
Yeah, so I hear, but so initially, did you walk away feeling, well, that didn't really go anywhere, but something else happened? You were subsequently contacted by Bernard Looney, but
yeah,
the initial reaction and what happened afterwards.
So actually, I met Bernard Looney that day. So I think after all the proceedings were over, they take a couple of hours. He came to find me straight afterwards to have a conversation, and that was really good. I mean, I hadn't met him before, but that first meeting was really lovely because he said to me, your question made me feel really sad. And I could tell that he really meant it. It was a bit of an emotional moment where I felt he really understood my point of view. And so he said, will you promise to come and talk to me about this? So 3 months later, I had the opportunity to spend an hour with him, kind of explaining more about what I meant.
And tell me about that meeting then.
I proceeded to gather stories and information data from kind of 30 individuals, had one-on-one conversations, and pulled those stories together in a survey that I did. So I was able to present him with some, graphs because he's an engineer. I thought he'd like some graphs, and brought them to life with stories about, my friends and colleagues. And the meeting was great. I was really impressed with how well he listened. He let me control the agenda of the meeting. I think, I put all my papers down on the desk and he could kind of see that I'd got some things to say. So he just let me get on with it. And he really listened and asked great questions. And I just really felt like, I'd really been listened to. This was the feeling that I really came away with.
And ultimately, this began a process that ended with a job offer. Tell me about that.
Yes, well, this wasn't the objective. It was always about kind of representing people's views. But I think what came across in that meeting was my passion for the company. Maybe it's something that, Bernard and I both feel, and many people in BP have a passion for the company. And this belief that it can do great things. So I don't know, there was just a connection in that meeting that just meant there was a conversation about how I could help. Actually, towards the end of the meeting, they did talk about some of the plans and that there was going to be a new company purpose. And I just instinctively said, you can't do that without me, without even thinking. And it's not the kind of thing I'd normally say, but I just felt all things I'd done over 5 years had kind of led me to a point where I was ready to really help them with this new direction.
So in a sense, you said, you got to hire me back to help you with this.
Yeah, I suppose I did. not
did.
In those words. Yeah.
And they did.
That was really great. I think it's great that they are prepared to hire someone that is prepared to criticize, point out problems, but not just that. Try and think of solutions as well, because that's the really hard work. We all know what the problem is. I think trying to get ourselves to solutions is really important. So I think it feels good that they would hire someone like me.
So now you're back in there. You've got this position. Tell me about your role there now. I mean, do you consider yourself an internal agent, force them to hold their feet to their fire? I mean, we talk about the concept of speaking truth to power, and that's really what this exercise is all about, isn't it?
The way that I've approached my role over the past year, because I came back in January, it's now November, has changed. I felt like a kind of campaigner and really trying to push BP faster than they were prepared to go. And I just recognized that I was going to get quite exhausted if I kind of kept pushing like that. And now I see my role as trying to help them on this journey because they've announced a massive amount of change. And it's really important we make this work. So I see my role more as kind of helping them make that happen. And then in terms of I suppose my role splits into three categories. And I feel like I work with leadership to help them kind of think about leadership in a more purpose-driven way. We're doing a series of workshops with the top 120. And then the second piece is kind of building a movement or building at least an understanding of what purpose-led business is, what it means to have purpose in your career. And I've got some ideas for the future on that one. And then the third thing that I do is help, I suppose, anybody in people and culture who's trying to embed purpose in the way that we do things in our processes and particularly in our culture. So it's quite a broad role, and I work across, lots of pieces of our business. So I have real freedom, and that's really fantastic.
So it's still relatively early days, though. You're in the first months of this brand new role in a venerable corporation. I mean, how are you feeling about it in terms of your job satisfaction? Do you feel you're making a difference? And just tell me how it's affecting you on a personal level.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a overall great, but I think it's a challenge. It's a personal challenge, isn't it? There aren't many people that have kind of been in an oil company, come out and worked in NGOs and then gone back. And that, I think it's a big adjustment. I think it was a big adjustment for me. There's a lot of kind of growth in that amount of stretch. I think it's going well. I think that the challenge is that sense of frustration of understanding climate urgency and then being in a really big organization where some change is fast, but other change can seem slow. So it's mixed.
Really?
I think overall it's going great, but that sense of urgency around climate change it makes it quite hard sometimes.
It's an awfully large ship to turn around, isn't it? Whose whole existence has been to produce oil and gas. So that's a pretty big challenge, isn't it?
It is, and it's good that it's not all on my shoulders. I mean, and BP has been doing that for 110 years. So this is the biggest transformation the company's ever gone through. But I think we're all really we can't generalize about everybody, but there's a massive amount of passion for this. I think before this change happened, there was a worry, and it just feels like a relief now that we've got this new strategic direction. It's kind of what a lot of us had really, really wanted for a long time. So,
some very practical matters that have to be dealt with to reach the goal that Mr. Looney articulated. I'm looking in my research, found out that Fred Krupp of Environmental Defense told Mr. Looney that to meet those goals, they need to massively, quickly shift away from fossil fuel production to low carbon alternatives, to reduce pollutants like methane around oil facilities, and to take measures such as protecting tropical rainforests. In other words, a multi-phase approach. How's that going? Is that achievable?
So great question. I suppose I feel there's two questions in there. Is it achievable for the world? And I really, really hope so. And then is it achievable for BP? And I think it is achievable for BP. It's what our strategy should help us deliver and do. But I think we're very aware that, the challenge of getting to net zero by 2050 or sooner, I mean, it won't be any good if just one company does it. We all have to try and get there.
Ultimately, we're dealing in this strange time of the pandemic with relatively low oil and gas international prices, but they may well go up at some point, and when they go up, that's how oil companies make their money, by drilling for more oil and gas. How will BP deal with this pressure to drill more if prices go up?
Oil and gas projects take kind of decades to, from the beginning of exploration through to like the delivery of a major project. So, you can't capitalize on short-term oil price spikes, and that's just not kind of how it works. And I suppose we're just trying to be a lot more long-term about it. Like, what is the long-term value that BP wants to create? And it's about, reimagining energy and decarbonizing the energy system. So we've got to move away from short-term price fluctuations controlling our decision-making.
But ultimately, we are talking about leaving more oil and gas in the ground, though, aren't we?
I think the question is more, what is the way that we're going to decarbonize our energy system? And part of that will mean leaving oil and gas in the ground. And what are the things that are going to really change the system? And I think it's got to be kind of investing in renewables and alternatives that means we won't need as much oil and gas. And I think there's something around carbon pricing as well. But I'm not that I'm an expert in that. But I think that basically the solution's got to be economic. We've got to make renewables competitive and kind of put oil. That's the way oil and gas is going to go out of business and stay in the ground.
So it'll stay in the ground when the alternatives are better.
Yeah. Well, cheaper for the customer, and also lower impact on the planet. Where we say that people want their energy to be affordable, reliable, and also clean. So I think if we can deliver that, that's what people want.
Mr. Looney's announcement, of course, caused a huge amount of attention, but this is not the first time that BP's gotten attention for an initiative like this. In the early 2000s, it had its Beyond Petroleum campaign. I guess that's when it did away with the British Petroleum name and turned into simply BP. But as you well know, in retrospect, it was seen as a PR exercise in greenwashing that caused a lot of cynicism. What does BP say to the world now to convince them that this is different?
Well, back then I didn't see it as a PR exercise. We made a huge amount of investment in alternative energy, as we called it then. I think in 2005 said that we'd invest $8 billion over 10 years. So it was not insubstantial. It was really significant. And I think I was very disappointed that it didn't work out, as a lot of people in BP were as well. So I didn't feel like it was a PR exercise. And I think it's a great shame that it didn't kind of turn the company into something different then. It feels like that's the job to do now. And people often ask, what's the difference between then and now? And I think that the context that we work within has completely changed. And that's something that I found out when I, got outside of BP and into the world and discovered responsible investment and the way that investors are thinking about climate risk has really come onto the agenda now, in the way that it wasn't there in the early 2000s, and the way that the price of solar and wind has come down, and that has been an incredible story. So the world has changed. I think in the early 2000s we were too early, but now it's ready. So this now makes a kind of, there is a strong business case for this, as well as kind of being the right thing to do. So that's why we think it'll work out this time.
So have you set in your own mind the kind of goals that BP needs to meet in order for you to continue and feel like that you've made a contribution?
Yes, vaguely. Well, so I had criteria that I was looking for in order to stay this year, because I knew that there was going to be a huge announcement about the new strategy. And what I was looking for was that we would count and reduce Scope 3 emissions. I think that's really important. So the emissions from burning our oil and gas product is something that we're going to be reducing. So I'm really happy about that. And as I said, really happy about those 5 aims that help the world get to net zero, acknowledging our ability to influence others and take that position in the world. So that felt really good. So I'm thinking, yeah, I should stay. And then I think going forward, I think it's so important to me that we do what we said we're going to do, really delivering on the objectives that we've set ourselves, And also I want my ideas to be listened to. I kind of think there's no point me being there if some of these, things that I'm pushing for, and I can't get traction and I can't get those delivered. So, and I just basically want to have a really positive impact. And as long as I can do that, I'm going to stay.
Okay. Well, we'll all be watching with great interest.